false start. Sarah has promised to put out the recording, so I wanted to make sure that we were covered there. So this is PPPSCs, and our focus on this one is those children who are placed by their parents or IEPs. And this is a requirement is linked to specific fiscal requirements that Marlene will be going over. Each LEA must allocate a proportionate share of their IDEA allocation to provide equitable services to eligible students in private schools within their jurisdiction. And in South Carolina, homeschools are treated and seen as private schools, private entities. Yeah. Marlene, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure. All right. I am not able to forward. Here we go. Child fine for parentally placed private school children with disabilities. Each LEA just in public school are charged with locating, identifying, and evaluating all children with disabilities who are enrolled by their parents in private, including religious schools, elementary schools, and secondary schools. And of course, those are also your homeschools. And there are options for homeschools in South Carolina, 3 options. But those that are located in the school district served by the LEA. So the South Carolina law defines elementary school as no lower than kindergarten and no higher than 8th grade. And the secondary schools can have different grade configurations, but no higher than 12th grade. And this right here is the results outcome. So on the left is what you would see in your public school settings. And students receive a free appropriate public education, that FAPE. But on the left side, the elementary and secondary, or on the right side, I'm sorry, elementary and secondary students with disabilities unilaterally enrolled by their parents in a private school may receive equitable services in the amount of the proportionate share of IDEA funds determined through annual and ongoing meaningful consultations, and we'll talk further on that, with a representative of the private or a home school, outlined in an individual service plan, the ISP. And it's not an IEP, but an ISP. And no individual right to equitable services. Yeah, some. All right, so Marlene, you'll have to tell me, I can't see where we are with the slides. You'll have to help me with that. So what does eligibility mean? Students with disabilities under IDEA are eligible until they age out, they graduate with a diploma. They're no longer eligible through an evaluation. And there is one other condition of eligibility for parentally placed private school children, refusal of the parents to be evaluated or reevaluated. So how do we determine the number of parentally placed private school children? A
Okay.
student, sure,
Sarah, I think that's me.
okay.
Okay, I'm going to take the next several slides because what we're going to be talking about is the way that we determine proportionate share. And the first thing we have to understand is who are these children and make sure that we have the appropriate count. So how do we determine the number of parentally placed private school children? Of course, and you will know these things, but just as a reminder, a student is only eligible under IDEA if he has been evaluated and determined to have a disability by an IEP team. So a private school cannot just tell you they have 20 children with disabilities without you having the evidence to support that. So the children we're likely to find are those children who have been evaluated under your general child find requirements that apply to everyone, who were in public school and transferred to private school or began homeschooling. And this should indicate to you that you need to have a process in your district for identifying those students who've withdrawn. Eligible for an IASP. And then those children in private school settings who are identified through Child Find. Because of your Child Find efforts, which include private schools. Okay, next slide. Record keeping. These are the three things that are required in the federal regulations. That you must maintain records of the number of children evaluated. And of course, we're talking about these parentally placed private school children. The number evaluated, the number of those children determined to be children with disabilities, and the number served. There's no requirement for you to serve all of the children. So that's important. So by simple subtraction, then we could figure out how many are not served, because you probably are aware that our student database doesn't currently collect all of those children who've been identified but aren't served. Some modules were put in a couple of years ago to help start that process, but we know that some districts may have children who were identified 3, 4, 5 years ago, but have never been served or are not currently being served. And we can't know that, only you know that. Okay, next slide. So what we have to provide for children in parentally placed private school is a proportionate share of your IDEA funding. And this calculation is done on the entire grant award, both 611 and 619. So you don't deduct out things like CEIS or indirect cost or your administrative responsibilities or child find. It's on the total grant award. So what then you are called to do is to provide special education and related services in that amount of money. And we're going to assume that that amount of federal money will not serve all of the private school children, because of course, if they're in public school, we also have state and local funds that are used first. So that's why you are allowed to determine what services you will provide in order to spend that amount of money. And I know it probably sounds a little contrary to what we know about IDEA, because with our public school children, we never talk about how much money we must spend, or we only have this pot of money, because FAPE the child is entitled to FAPE regardless of what the cost is. but private school is different. So if your proportionate share is $10,000 for this year, 23, 24, you need to plan to spend $10,000. And that meets your obligation. So you have to know your population well enough to know what services could be provided that maybe reaches the most of your children, expends that total amount of money. And as I said earlier, this is by both 3 to 5 year olds under 619 and 3 to 21 under the 611 grant. And yes, the 3 to 5 group will be counted twice because there are 2 awards and they are specific in those age ranges. So you do the calculation on each pot of money. Now, to make this just a little bit more complicated, for those younger children, Sarah pointed out on an earlier slide that proportionate share is taken for elementary and secondary. Those parentally placed private school children must be in an elementary or secondary program. And elementary begins at kindergarten. So the only children you would have who would be eligible for parentally placed private school children, who would be proportionate share, are those 5-year-olds who are in kindergarten or kindergarten age. Our 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds who are not yet eligible for kindergarten, those are just our preschool children with disabilities, and they're entitled to FAPE. So you cannot consider them to be parentally placed private school children, no matter where they are. They are probably in a private daycare or a private preschool, but that does not make them parentally placed private school children, not until they become 5-year-old kindergarten age.
About that.
Sure. I have a question, Marlene.
Okay.
Hey, it's Tabitha. How are you?
All right.
Good. So question is, if a child who is 5 is repeating pre-K, a 4K classroom, but the child is 5, I feel like there's a little gray there. Like, can we, go ahead.
They're 5, but are they kindergarten age, which means they had to have turned 5 before September 1?
Yes, but they are in a pre-K 4 classroom.
Right, but they are still elementary age. They're in a private setting that has them in a 3-4 configured class. Is that
Yes,
correct?
ma'am. And the parent did not want the child, the parents in consultation with the school did not want the child, he was not ready to go into kindergarten. So
Okay,
they held him back another year to stay a whole nother year in 4K.
I think, and I do think there's possibly some gray area there, but I think the best bet is to count that child as PPPSC. He does meet that criteria. If I might think through that differently if that was an IEP team decision.
Mhm.
That the child that might be a different scenario, but if a parent requesting that, I think we'd have to go by his age. But if
I had a follow-up question to your question.
We have another follow-up question.
If she's not done.
Yeah, I was not, I mean, this particular situation, it wasn't IEP team. It was a different eligibility. Team found him eligible and was designing the program, and the question that came into play is what services are we obligated to provide him? And so guidance was given. I was just curious what your guidance would have been given that situation, but I think I have a good understanding.
and I'd be glad to talk with you further about it. I can just see scenarios if this is parent, a parent choice. But what if they choose, that maybe they choose next year to also hold in that class? I'm thinking we need to go by age. I could very well be wrong on that and be glad to discuss the specifics of that situation further if you need to.
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
But there was another follow-up question.
Yeah, so my question is related to if the student is enrolled in one of your district programs, but is 5 years old, in an early childhood program, say it's like CERDEP or Head Start or something like that. It wouldn't be Head Start, but maybe CERDEP. If then you would provide them only those services that you're providing on ISP versus IEP, because at that point they would be enrolled in a district program. But they would be school age. And so that's kind of, I guess what mine is, because I could foresee that becoming hairy, if you will.
Sarah, I'm having some trouble. I think just the distance from the microphone. This was, I think the question's about a child enrolled in a public school.
Yeah, so was your question about a student enrolled in one of your programs? Yeah.
Well, it was a private.
Oh, it's private. Oh, okay. So I guess mine would be, well, we didn't run into that.
Okay.
She withdraws her question. I withdraw my question.
She withdrew her question.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, I was having trouble hearing that. Sarah, is there any way you could tilt the camera so I can see people?
Yes.
I can do this. I do think I still want to ask that question actually, because we have a student in preschool self-contained currently in this situation
Okay.
where the parent wants him to do another year of preschool. They don't feel like he's developmentally or academically ready to go to kindergarten. And it is an IEP team conversation, which makes me feel like it would be an IEP service. Draw again. No, I just had a baby and my brain is like, so like, right.
Well, and it is a confusing scenario because of what, we're talking about private school. We're so used to public school, how we service children. So, yeah.
We just have a lot of ISP students coming through right now, and I can foresee a lot of conversations coming up with regard to, because a lot of parents are keeping their kids in preschool longer, why they can't stay on an IEP. And it like the hard
Yeah.
time, age 5 is totally fine. That's what we've been doing, but I just anticipate a lot of conversations about that.
Yeah, because then you may have a teacher who potentially has IEPs and ISPs in the same classroom, which could be confusing in implementation as well.
Yeah.
And can be confusing to the parent who knows that this Johnny's getting OT and this one cannot, and why can that one get it and this one can't? So yeah, I totally get it.
Marlene, can you see?
I can see, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's still difficult to hear the conversation, but I caught that part of it is, or that someone was commenting about teachers who might have IEP and ISP children in the same classroom and teachers not understanding why one was eligible for certain services and the other was not. I can see that would be a good question. Why can't this child get the same? I understand that. So was there, Sarah, is there a question or anything that you could put in the chat that, or do we just need to move on?
I can't bring up the chat, so.
No, I mean, that's okay. That's okay. Are we ready to move on?
Yes,
Yes.
any other questions? Okay, yes.
Okay. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the annual child count, or the annual count of the number of parentally placed private school children with disabilities. And when you read the regs, it is so confusing because they talk about the annual child count for both the private school, but also we have our annual child count of all children with disabilities. This count is a little bit different in that you must include those children who were eligible, even if they're not being served. So those children who were identified, and your district, for example, says, we're going to provide these services. You design your plan. that child wasn't eligible for the particular services that your district is offering right now. Or you could have offered an ISP and the parent said, I don't want one. They're still eligible children because they met eligibility criteria under IDEA. So we must continue to count them until they meet one of those criteria to be dismissed that Sarah went over earlier. They graduate with a diploma, they age out. And in the circumstance of these children, if the parent should refuse evaluation or reevaluation or fail to make the child available or just not respond, you can then take that child off your list. So for parentally placed children, in addition to those who are served, which we will already capture on the child count, the annual child count, you also have to have the numbers of those eligible children who are not receiving services. And you'll plug those into your application and it'll do the calculation for you. But we won't be able to pull those numbers for the unserved children. But that count should be done the same day as the annual child count. So if our child count was October 23 of 2023, then on that same date, you need to pull the eligible but not served children. So we know we're comparing at the same point in time. Another thing that is important, I'm sorry, Sarah, thank you. Another thing that's important to remember about this, when we do that annual child count of parentally placed private school children, it is used in the proportionate share calculation for your next grant award. The funds don't follow the children. So a lot of times when we're talking with districts, they'll say, well, that child who was in kindergarten, for example, that child is no longer with us. He moved. It doesn't have anything to do with the child. It's numbers. And these numbers are going to tell you what you must spend in the next year. Okay, next slide. What is meaningful consultation? Well, it's pretty well spelled out in the regulations, and these are all of the things that you must discuss at your consultation. If you have a meeting where you invite all of your private school and homeschool providers and homeschool parents in, and you do that in one meeting, some of you like to do personal visits to your private schools, and that's great. But in whatever the setting is, you need to make sure that you are covering all of these required components. We've had, through monitoring, we've had a couple of districts where they have joined in with Title I and some other federal programs that have private school components to invite those folks in. And, you know, on one hand, I can see that seems like a very efficient use of time. On the other hand, I have not seen one yet where they met all the IDEA requirements. So if you choose to do that, collaborate with other offices, remember that you have an obligation that is different from Title I or Title III. You have an obligation that is unique to IDEA and it's unique to children. It's not about the private school. So it's about finding these children and serving these children. Okay, next slide. And Sarah, that's you.
Yes, thank you. Those provision of services. First of all, those decisions about those services, they can't be in advance. That's one thing that we are finding with districts, and that the federal government has even pointed out to the states that when you go into the consultations, you can't just say, oh, we're just giving speech. That's the only services we're providing, because that just negates the meaningful consultation piece of it. So some of those services that you can provide are direct services, of course. Those indirect services, so parent and teacher training, only to that specific child's disability. So you're not training, all the teachers, for example, about all the different categories or just in general. The equipment and or materials that can also be provided to the private schools. But the equipment remains the property of the district, so that when the child moves on, that equipment comes back to the district. And also transportation, and I put a link in there for the Q&A servicing for transportation. It is on an individual basis, and so that would be a team decision. Those restrictions, of course, like I said, the equipment must be remain in the district property. The equipment or material cannot benefit the private school environment, such as renovation, so it can't be anything that is permanent. Administrative costs and the funds that you receive, the proportionate share cannot just be handed over to the district. All that has to come through the district. And Marlene?
Okay. This is something we don't talk about that much because, we like to talk about the things that districts need to do to be in compliance rather than talk about what the possible repercussions are. But it's important to realize that the private school official has a right to submit a complaint to the State Department of Education. And their rights to submit that complaint, this is found in the private school regulations. It's not in our procedural safeguards piece because it doesn't apply to our public school children, of course. But they can submit a complaint to the state that the LEA did not engage in consultation that was meaningful and timely, or did not give due consideration to the views of the private school official. And that goes back to what Sarah was saying about don't go into that consultation having already determined what you're going to provide. That can only be decided after consultation. Okay, next slide. And then due process complaints and state complaints. Just like the services to private schools are not the same as we would find in public schools. It's not a requirement to provide FAPE. It's a requirement to provide equitable services. And in the same vein, the due process complaint system is not available to parents the same way it is in public schools. But private school children, the parents of private school children still have a right to due process complaints or state complaints based on child fine. So that's why it is so important that you document all of your attempts to work with private schools. And we know that a lot of times you'll have these opportunities and the private school representatives will not be in attendance. Some of them do not care to have participation with the public schools. Some of them will tell you that they don't want to have these services. But remember, these are not services for the private school. These are services for the children. So sometimes we have our workarounds. We need to be able to support that we've done our duty to implement child find in the community. We've advertised, we have it on our website. Parents have plenty of opportunities to locate you and find out how to go through the child find process if they believe their child has a disability. So that's one thing that they will always have the right for, because the child find requirement is for all children, even those in private schools, including religious private schools. So they would go through the state complaint process just as any public school child's parents would be eligible to do. And then the private school official would go through that complaint process that I mentioned just a minute ago about filing a complaint with the state that the district had failed to engage in timely and meaningful consultation and to give due credit to their recommendations and suggestions. And of course, remember, if the private school official, and when in South Carolina, we say private and home as together, so private homeschool official, if they contest or want to dispute what your decision was, then you have to provide an explanation of that to them. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about expenditures for just a few minutes. I think you all are far enough into the year that you probably already understand most of this, but it is important that you document very carefully your expenditures for PPPSC. We use in South Carolina Function 149 to designate those expenditures, and that helps with tracking. Because, as I mentioned earlier, for example, if the district's required expenditure is $10,000, you have to support how you spent that $10,000. If you can't spend it all in the first year of the grant award, you have to carry it over into the second year. This is different from other functions in our IDEA grant that we can do amendments and move between function codes. We have to keep this money for PPPSC in that function and try to spend it by the end of the second year. And only at that time can we consider allowing the district to move that into another function. Next slide. So if the district is not able to expend the entire amount, then OSIS conducts a monitoring process to determine that the LEA has complied with all of the PPPSC regulations. And Sarah's going to tell you a little bit more about what that looks like. But this is something that is federally required because we can't allow you to move the money unless you demonstrate that you've met all those requirements. And if you have not, then we have to send the money back to the U.S. Department of Education. So we spend a great deal of time with districts trying to help them make sure that they've used every avenue to try to expend these funds. If we do determine through this desk monitoring process that you were in compliance, then we can allow you to submit an amendment to change that to another function. Okay, next slide. So what we do, and this starts about this time of year, so this is very timely. In April and May, Fiona and Jeannie and the FGM team will start identifying those districts that have large remaining balances in proportionate share. They'll contact them and ask them if they anticipate being able to fully expend the money by September 30th. And those who respond that they are unable to expend the funds, then that's when you go through this desk monitoring process with us to hopefully determine how you have documented all of your expenditures and all of the attempts you made to spend those funds. Okay, next.
So what that process looks like Marlene said, Fiona and Jeannie, they reach out to you, and then if you were to tell them that you're not unable to expend it, they contact me as the program person. I will reach out to the district and ask you to submit all your documentation that Marlene talked about earlier. So that's your consultation affirmations, your your evidence for services, what services you provided, and those meaningful consultation forms that you have with the homeschool associations or the private schools. And that process in itself is ongoing. We're also seeing where meetings will these meaningful consultations will take one time a year, but OSEP actually outlines that it should be done more than once a year. So it should be an ongoing process, meeting with the private schools or the home schools. And so we asked for also the invitations, because we also know that sometimes, you won't get a response. So we asked for a variety of modes of ways to contact the private school, whether it be telephone logs, emails, snail mail, however you're trying to contact them. We have one district that just has a check mark. Are you going to come or not? And so that makes, and with the self-addressed envelope, so it comes back to them and that's their evidence. So those are the kind of things, the evidence that you'll be submitting to the state. And then we meet with the district, the team does, Fiona, Jeannie, Marlene, and I will meet with the state, the district, talk about, some of those efforts and some of those evidence, and maybe help you, look for other things, because we're also looking for child find evidence. Are you putting things out in the newspaper or flyers, or, how are you reaching out to your community? So those are some of the evidence that we would be asking for. I can't remember, is this mine, Marlene?
Well, I think we were both going to share some things under here, but it's common misunderstandings that lead to noncompliance. And these are issues that we've just collected over a period of time. And I can kind of go through them quickly. I missed something, but I mentioned earlier about the calculation of proportionate share has to be both the students served and those who are eligible but not served. And including 3- and 4-year-olds are
So actually,
much more than we think.
Marlene, you cut out a little bit, and that is something I wanted to address, because that was sort of one of the questions over here. And that is a misunderstanding. Sometimes districts will include 3- and 4-year-olds, which they do not belong in this proportionate share calculation. They are, students who fall under the FAPE.
Right. And then, of course, not expending the entire amount. And I would just say this, as I mentioned earlier, make sure you're planning to spend that amount. If you have $20,000 and you plan to spend that on one child receiving a service 30 minutes a week, that's not planning to spend your proportionate share. Your plan needs to match the amount of money. Not doing consultation on an ongoing basis, and Sarah has given you several good examples of that. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to go through the whole process of determining how services again, but keeping up with these folks so that they know how their children can access these services is evidence of ongoing. And make sure you include your homeschool children. Make sure you spend this money out of IDEA. We will sometimes get districts that say, oh, we've served those children, but we serve them using general fund money. That doesn't count. I'm sorry. We have to account for the amount spent from IDEA. And then assuming that the private school can reject services. Remember, we're not offering anything to the private school. We're not giving anything to the private school. These are services for these identified children. So even if they don't want to participate and they won't allow you to come on their campus to do evaluations or services, we still have other ways, and our broader child find requirement still includes those private school children. Sarah, there's some others that you can think of?
Yeah, offhand, I can't think of any offhand.
One thing that I'll mention when we get ready when we're doing our training on the new application for next year, we will talk a little bit more about PPPSC. For next year, there's another thing to consider is that we now have the Education Scholarship Trust Fund, which is state funded, an opportunity for some children to apply for a scholarship for private school. So even if they are recipients of that trust scholarship, Education Trust Scholarship, they are still entitled to PPPSC. So make sure that there's no confusion there about assuming that because they had that scholarship that they don't qualify for PPPSC, but they do. And we'll talk more about that when we get to our application process in the summer.
And I just wanted to back up on that, spending the proportionate share from the general fund rather than from IDEA. That's a matter of sometimes looking over your direct services when they submit their bill. Sometimes they'll go ahead and put the wrong the wrong coding in it. So it's just backing up and making sure that you know you're applying it to the right fund.
Okay.
Here are some resources that we've given you. We also we have a Google site with some sample forms that you would be able to use. They aren't here, but we'll also include that as well. But there is OSEP has provided a Q&A that they put out in 2022, and so these are valuable links that we've provided for you.
That Q&A is quite lengthy, but it does have a lot of good information in it. I'd encourage you to read that. But it's pretty well organized into sections. So if you're just looking at evaluation or looking at what are equitable services, you can kind of hone in on that. But it's a good document you need to have handy.
Any questions? You know, if you have any issues or any questions that you come up, you can email me or Marlene. Whatever, I don't know, we have a team, so we always are able to consult with each other. So we're here to support you in any way you need, any questions you have or concern.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I wasn't able to follow all the conversation. I hadn't anticipated the reverberation in the room and how much that was going to affect me, but I always am glad to try to help you problem solve. So don't hesitate to email if there's anything that I can do to help you.
Marlene, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We
See you later.
appreciate you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.